Close your eyes. Let yourself drift, not forward into the future, but backward, 2,000 years, to a city alive with stone and marble, voices and footsteps. A city that was, in its time, the center of the known world. Rome. Here, the rhythms of daily life unfold not in history books but in the chatter of markets, the scrape of sandals on cobblestones, the laughter of children echoing in courtyards. It is a place of grandeur and hardship, luxury and poverty, emperors and slaves. Yet for most, life is neither legend nor epic. It is ordinary, human, full of familiar moments. Waking, working, eating, resting. Tonight, we'll wander through those ordinary hours. We'll follow the morning light spilling across tiled rooftops, step into kitchens where bread is broken, and walk streets where merchants call out their wares. We'll see how Romans lived not in the myths of conquest, but in the small details of everyday existence. So breathe slowly and imagine yourself in a world of oil lamps, mosaics, and stone walls, where the day begins much as it always has, with the simple act of waking up. The first sounds of Rome at dawn are not trumpets or proclamations, but ordinary noises. The bray of donkeys, the squeal of cartwheels, the bark of a dog. As the sun begins to rise over the tiled roofs, a faint golden light catches on marble columns and dusty brick. In the streets, shopkeepers unlatch wooden shutters. The air carries a blend of scents, baking bread from a nearby oven, smoke from charcoal fires, and the faint tang of fish brought in from the Tiber. For the nearly 1 million people who lived in Rome at its height, the start of the day depended greatly on where you slept. The wealthy stirred in spacious domus, elegant houses arranged around an atrium. These homes often opened inward, with no windows facing the street. Instead, sunlight filtered through a central opening above the atrium pool, casting rippling reflections onto painted walls. Floors might be covered in intricate mosaics, scenes of gods, dolphins, or geometric patterns, reminders of wealth and education. Behind the atrium stretched gardens, fountains, and shaded colonnades where the day could begin in quiet luxury. But most Romans were not so fortunate. The majority lived in insulae, apartment blocks of brick and wood that crowded together, 5 or 6 stories tall. They loomed above narrow streets, their upper floors swaying with the wind and creaking at night. Rent was cheaper the higher you climbed, but water had to be carried up by hand, and fire was a constant threat. Whole blocks sometimes collapsed under their own weight, and Roman satirists joked about tenants who never knew if they'd live to see morning. Here, dawn was noisy. Neighbors clattering pots, babies crying, footsteps echoing on thin wooden floors. Regardless of wealth, the day began early. For slaves, often the first to rise, there was work to be done before the household stirred. Fires needed to be coaxed to life, water drawn from public fountains or wells, floors swept, and lamps extinguished. In wealthier homes, a trusted slave might wake the master with warm water for washing, while others hurried to prepare the morning meal. In insulae, where families often cooked on small braziers or bought food from street vendors, the smells of frying chickpeas or flatbread quickly filled the cramped air. Family life revolved around the paterfamilias, the legal head of the household. His authority extended over his wife, children, and even slaves. He could arrange marriages, conduct business, and in earlier times held the power of life and death. Yet in practice, much of the household rhythm came from women. Mothers overseeing children, managing servants, and handling the practical affairs of daily life. Children might begin the day with lessons, tracing letters on wax tablets, or reciting lines of poetry under the watch of a tutor. The morning meal, called ientaculum, was simple. Bread dipped in watered wine was common. Some added cheese, olives, figs, or honey, if they could afford it. The bread itself varied, from coarse loaves bought cheaply in bakeries to fine white bread reserved for wealthier households. Archaeologists at Pompeii have even found carbonized loaves stamped with the baker's name, as bakeries produced bread on an industrial scale for the city. For poorer Romans, street vendors offered hot porridge or flatbread sprinkled with salt. Eating was often quick and practical. The day ahead promised labor, politics, or study. As the sun rose higher, the city stirred to life. Crowds poured into the streets. Artisans carrying tools, farmers bringing produce, and officials heading toward the forum. Women visited markets to buy vegetables and fish, haggling over prices. The rumble of carts carrying amphorae of olive oil and wine echoed against stone walls. Even in these early hours, Rome was alive with motion. Yet amid the bustle, each household began in its own rhythm, whether under painted ceilings or in creaking wooden lofts. Morning in Rome was a reminder of contrasts. Wealth and poverty, elegance and danger, leisure and toil. But it was also familiar. A family gathered around bread. A child rubbing sleep from his eyes. A dog stretched out in a doorway. 2,000 years may separate us, but the start of a Roman day was not so different from our own. The streets of Rome are awake now, filling with the footsteps of men and women moving toward their work. Bakers rise earliest of all, their ovens already blazing before the sun is high. The smell of fresh loaves drifts into the alleys, warm and comforting, a reminder that bread was the foundation of Roman life. Blacksmiths hammer iron into tools and horseshoes, sparks flashing in dark workshops. Shoemakers sit cross-legged, mending sandals worn thin by endless walking across stone streets. Fishmongers lay out their catch from the Tiber or the coast, their stalls slick with scales, voices sharp as they call out prices. Teachers gather boys in shaded corners or rented rooms, reciting lines of poetry or drilling letters on wax tablets. Farmers who have risen with the dawn led donkeys into the city, baskets laden with vegetables, fruit, and jars of oil. Not all work is manual. Senators and equestrians, the elite orders, do not labor in forges or fields. Their wealth comes from land, vast estates spread across Italy or provinces abroad, worked by slaves or tenant farmers. The owners might spend the day in the forum, surrounded by clients, handling political duties, or simply being seen in public. To manage land and wealth was their labor, though it often meant issuing orders while others performed the toil. Commerce gathers in the Forum Romanum, the beating heart of the city. Stalls crowd the open spaces, and merchants call out above the noise. You hear the rhythm of bargaining. Olives weighed in baskets, honey dripped into clay jars, herbs bundled and tied with string. Farmers stand behind carts of produce, their donkeys stamping the dust. Spices, their scent sharp and unfamiliar, draw attention even in small amounts. There is laughter, complaint, and the rustle of coin purses. Shops line the narrow streets, their counters opening directly to passers-by. These tabernae are small, often little more than a single room, but they are everywhere. Bakers selling flat loaves, cobblers displaying sandals on the doorway, wine sellers pouring cups of cheap red for thirsty laborers. The shopkeepers live above their work, crammed into the upper stories of the insulae, so that family and business blend together. A child peers down from a window while his father weighs beans at the counter below. All of this rests on coinage. The sestertius, a large brass coin, changes hands constantly, enough to buy a cup of wine, a loaf of bread, or a seat at a cheap performance. Silver denarii carry more value, stamped with the profile of emperors, their faces recognized by millions across the empire. Even the small copper asses pass quickly from hand to hand, making up the smallest exchanges. The coins are not only money, but messages, propaganda in metal, spreading the names and victories of rulers with each purchase. Beyond the forum, warehouses by the Tiber fill with goods unloaded from ships. Rome is a hungry city, its population too vast to feed itself. Grain ships arrive from Egypt, their sails heavy with the winds of the Mediterranean. Without them, the people would starve, and so the grain fleet is guarded as carefully as armies. Spain provides olive oil in such abundance that broken amphorae pile up outside the city, shards forming whole hills of pottery. From Gaul and Italy flow wines of every quality, from sour and cheap to sweet vintages reserved for the wealthy. But trade reaches further still. Merchants and caravans bring silk from China, thin and shimmering, passed from hand to hand along the Silk Road. From India comes spices, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, precious enough to measure by the pinch. Ivory and gems travel from Africa, incense from Arabia, glass from Syria. These luxuries are rare, yet they color the life of Rome, the center of a web that stretches across 3 continents. Writers like Pliny the Elder complained that Romans poured out gold for such indulgences, enriching distant peoples. Still, demand never slowed. The work of Rome is both ordinary and extraordinary. A shoemaker bends over leather in a dim stall, while just a few streets away, senators discuss matters that affect provinces thousands of miles distant. A farmer haggles over figs, while in a shaded portico, a banker tallies transactions involving ships, estates, and entire fleets of grain. Together, these layers form the pulse of the city, a place where labor, trade, and wealth interlock to feed an empire. By midday, the heat of the sun presses down on the city. Shopkeepers pull back from their counters, and buyers retreat to shade. The noise of bargaining quiets for a while, replaced by the rustle of awnings and the hum of conversation. But the work never truly stops. Grain must still be unloaded, bread baked, sandals stitched, accounts balanced. Rome cannot pause, for it lives on a constant exchange of hands and voices, of goods brought from near and far, turned into the meals and comforts of ordinary people. When you listen closely, the city tells its story through labor. A hammer striking iron, a coin clinking against stone, a vendor shouting above the crowd. These sounds carry through the streets like a rhythm, steady and unbroken, binding bakers, senators, shoemakers, fishmongers, teachers, and farmers into one vast system. The empire's power may be remembered in monuments and wars, but its life was written in these daily exchanges: bread for coin, oil for wine, spices for silver, silk for gold. 1 million people depended on it, and each morning as Rome woke, the work began again. The appetite of Rome was as vast as the city itself. To feed nearly 1 million people each day required an endless supply of grain, oil, fruit, vegetables, and wine, carried into the city by carts and ships. Yet when we look closer at the tables and kitchens of ordinary Romans, we find a diet built on simple staples, punctuated by flavors both familiar and strange. Bread was the foundation. Every Roman, rich or poor, consumed it daily. Bakeries turned out loaves by the thousands, stamped with the baker's seal so customers could identify their source. In wealthier homes, bread might be made of fine white flour, light and soft. In poorer households, it was coarse, mixed with bran, barley, or even ground beans to stretch the flour further. Alongside bread came olive oil, poured from amphorae into jugs and jars. It was used for cooking, dipping, and even as a condiment on its own. Another staple was porridge, known as pulse. Made by boiling emmer wheat or barley into a thick paste, it could be eaten plain or flavored with vegetables, cheese, or herbs. For many, pulse was the most reliable and filling meal. Lentils, peas, onions, garlic, and cabbage rounded out the diet, foods inexpensive but nourishing, grown in abundance on farms around the city and in the countryside beyond. If one flavor could be said to define Roman cooking, it was garum. This fermented fish sauce was poured over meats, vegetables, even fruit, added by the spoonful to nearly everything. It was made by layering small fish with salt and herbs in large vats, left to ferment under the sun until it broke down into a pungent, savory liquid. Amphorae of garum were shipped across the empire, from Spain to the Levant, and Rome consumed them eagerly. To modern tastes, the idea of fish sauce on dessert might seem odd, yet Romans prized its sharp, salty depth the way many today prize soy sauce or Worcestershire. Wealthy households bought the finest varieties, sometimes called liquamen, while poorer families used cheaper, rougher blends. Either way, garum was inescapable, present on every table. The streets offered their own flavors. Vendors set up stalls at every corner, selling quick, hot food to busy Romans. Sausages sizzled on small grills, chickpeas roasted and popped in clay pans, pastries stuffed with dates or cheese-filled baskets. Hungry workers bought bread already dipped in oil or sprinkled with salt. Some stalls sold mulsum, wine sweetened with honey, served in clay cups. Others ladled steaming stews into bowls for those who could not cook at home. These street foods were the lifeblood of the working poor, many of whom lived in insulae too cramped and dangerous for indoor cooking. A passerby in Rome might be surrounded by the smells of frying, roasting, and baking at nearly every turn. For those who lingered longer, there were taverns, popinae. These were not elegant establishments, but noisy, smoky, crowded rooms where the lower classes gathered. A popina offered wine, bread, stews, olives, cheese, and the occasional cut of meat. Patrons reclined on benches or leaned at counters, gambling with dice, shouting over cups of sour wine, arguing politics or gossip. Many taverns doubled as brothels, their reputation more scandalous than refined. Yet for countless Romans they were the center of social life, a place to gather at the end of the day. Their walls were often painted with murals, cups, amphorae, or even lists of menu items with prices scratched in charcoal. Archaeological remains at Pompeii show counters with deep storage jars built right into them, still stained with wine and oil. If the popina was rough and common, the banquet of the elite was its opposite, an elaborate performance of wealth and culture. The wealthy dined not sitting upright, but reclining on couches arranged around low tables, following the Greek custom. Servants moved constantly through the room, pouring wine, carrying platters, clearing dishes. Guests were expected to bring conversation and wit, not only an appetite. Meals stretched for hours with entertainment in the form of musicians, dancers, or poets. The food at such banquets could be astonishingly exotic. Ancient writers record delicacies like dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, roasted peacock with shimmering feathers restored for display, flamingo tongues, or cuts of wild boar. More familiar fare included oysters, venison, game birds, figs, dates, and imported spices. Yet even these were transformed into spectacles by preparation. Sauces were rich with pepper, cumin, coriander, and always garum. Wine flowed constantly, but it was never drunk straight. It was diluted with water, sometimes flavored with herbs, honey, or even seawater. To drink wine unmixed was considered barbaric. Etiquette mattered deeply. Guests reclined in order of status, the most honored placed closest to the host. To be invited at all was a mark of prestige. The banquet was not only about food, but about influence, a setting where political alliances were forged, favors exchanged, and reputations made or broken. A generous host displayed his wealth and his taste, while a guest displayed his manners and his wit. Eating was a social performance as much as a bodily need. Even in humbler settings, meals carried meaning. Families gathered around bread and oil not only to nourish themselves but to affirm bonds of kinship. Offering food to household gods was part of daily ritual, linking meals to faith. To share food with friends was an act of hospitality. The rhythms of Roman life were marked not only by work and rest, but by eating together, pausing to share bread dipped in wine, to laugh, to argue, to listen. In the end, the table of Rome reflected the city itself. At the bottom, ordinary Romans sustained themselves on bread, porridge, lentils, and olives, perhaps enlivened by the bite of garum or the warmth of street food. In the middle, taverns provided both sustenance and noisy fellowship. At the top, banquets dazzled with rare flavors and performances, more spectacle than sustenance. Yet across all classes, food was never just fuel. It was identity, ritual, and connection. To eat in Rome was to participate in the life of the empire, whether crouched at a street stall or reclining on a couch beneath painted ceilings. The working day in Rome might be long, but leisure was just as central to the life of the city. Entertainment was not an occasional diversion, but a shared ritual, one that bound the population together. For emperors and politicians, it also served another purpose: distraction. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal wrote, were enough to keep the people content. And Rome provided both in astonishing abundance. The most famous spectacle of all was the gladiatorial games. In the Colosseum, with its tiers rising high above the arena floor, as many as 50,000 spectators gathered beneath the open sky. The structure itself was a marvel, its arches and corridors channeling streams of people to their seats. Senators sat in the best places, close to the action. Women and the poor were pushed higher, toward the blazing sun. When the games began, the roar of the crowd was deafening. Gladiators were both despised and admired, men trained to fight to the death or close to it. Some were slaves or prisoners of war, condemned to the arena. Others volunteered, seeking fame and the slim chance of fortune. They fought with swords, spears, tridents, and nets, each type of fighter carefully matched against another. The crowd watched with fascination, calling out for blood or mercy. Even emperors sometimes played to the moment, turning a thumb to decide the fate of a beaten man. For the spectators, the games were more than brutality. They were drama, ritual, and a reminder of Rome's power over life and death. If the Colosseum was Rome's theater of violence, the Circus Maximus was its theater of speed. This enormous stadium stretched out between the Palatine and Aventine hills, capable of holding an astonishing 150,000 people. Chariot racing was the favorite sport of the masses, and race days transformed the city. Teams were divided into colors: the reds, whites, blues, and greens, and fans supported them with a passion that rivaled modern sports rivalries. Drivers leaned low over their horses, whipping reins and shouting as they hurtled around the central barrier, the Spina, at breakneck speed. Crashes were common, spectacular tangles of horses and wood that drew gasps from the crowd. Betting was everywhere, from a copper coin wagered in a tavern to fortunes risked by the wealthy. The circus was not only about racing, but about identity and loyalty. To be a supporter of the Greens or Blues was to belong to a community, one that stretched across the entire empire. Not all leisure was loud and bloody. The public baths, or thermae, offered a different kind of entertainment, one woven into the daily rhythm of Roman life. Vast complexes spread across the city, some built by emperors as gifts to the people. Inside, visitors moved from hot rooms to cold plunges, exercised in open courtyards, strolled beneath mosaics and marble columns. Bathing was not just about hygiene, it was about gossip, business, and relaxation. Senators might discuss politics in the steam, while merchants struck deals over massages. Ordinary citizens could spend hours there for a small fee, enjoying facilities that rivaled palaces. Children splashed in pools, athletes trained, and poets recited lines. The baths were a social equalizer, where people of all backgrounds mingled, their differences blurred by steam and water. The theatre, too, was a staple of Roman leisure. Comedies, often adapted from Greek originals, filled stages with jokes about clever slaves, foolish husbands, and meddling wives. Tragedies told darker stories of gods, kings, and fate. But Romans also enjoyed lighter forms: mimes and pantomimes. Mimes were bawdy, slapstick performances, filled with crude humor, and often wordless. Pantomimes were elegant, featuring dances and music that told stories without speech. Crowds flocked to theaters across the city, drawn not only by the performances but by the sense of gathering, of being part of a shared audience. Actors themselves were often considered lowly, even disreputable, but the power of performance was undeniable. Gambling threaded itself through nearly every form of leisure. Dice games were ubiquitous, played in taverns, streets, and even respectable homes. Small cubes of bone or ivory clattered across tables, fortunes rising and falling in a moment. Laws against gambling existed but were rarely enforced, especially during festivals. Betting was particularly fierce at the chariot races, where partisans staked coins on their favored team. The excitement of chance was irresistible. Roman poets and satirists often mocked the obsession, but the habit endured, as much a part of leisure as the races or the games themselves. Children, too, had their diversions. Wooden hoops rolled along the streets, pushed with sticks as boys and girls raced each other. Knucklebones, the ancestor of jacks, were tossed into the air and caught in intricate patterns. Dolls carved of wood or fashioned from rags kept younger children occupied, while older boys sparred with wooden swords, imitating the gladiators they idolized. Play was not only fun, but preparation, teaching coordination, competition, and courage for the adult roles that lay ahead. Taken together, these layers of leisure reveal a society that lived not only for work or survival, but for spectacle and enjoyment. A day in Rome could shift from the roar of the Colosseum to the cheers of the circus, from the quiet steam of the baths to the laughter of the theater. For the people, entertainment was a release, a joy, and a community. For their rulers, it was also a tool, proof that to keep the people happy, one need only provide bread to fill their stomachs and endless diversions to occupy their minds. And so the city lived, not just in marble and stone, but in sound. The clash of swords, the thunder of hooves, the splash of bathwater, the rhythm of dice on wood, and the laughter of children in the streets. These were the notes of Roman leisure, woven as tightly into daily life as bread, oil, and wine. Religion in Rome was not confined to temples or priests. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, present in kitchens, courtyards, and street corners. To live in Rome was to exist under the watchful presence of countless gods, both great and small, whose favor was sought in gestures so ordinary they might pass unnoticed, yet so essential that life without them was unimaginable. In every household, the day began and ended with quiet rituals to the lares and penates, the protective spirits of the family in the storeroom. These gods were not distant beings but guardians of the home, watching over food, safety, and health. Small shrines stood in kitchens or courtyards, decorated with painted figures or small statues. Each morning a pinch of grain might be offered, a drop of wine poured onto the hearth, incense lit to carry prayers upward in smoke. Children grew up watching their parents tend these shrines, learning that the well-being of the family depended not only on work and food, but on respect for these unseen protectors. At the head of every household was the genius of the paterfamilias, the spirit of his authority and vitality. This too was honored, particularly on birthdays or family occasions, when offerings were made in gratitude for the life and strength of the family's leader. In these small devotions, Romans felt the closeness of the divine, a sense that the gods were present in every room, every meal, every breath. Yet private worship was only part of the picture. Public religion filled the city with grandeur. Temples stood on every hill and in every district, their columns rising above markets and forums. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus crowned the Capitoline Hill, a reminder of Rome's might and its chief god's protection. Altars dotted the streets, where travelers or soldiers might pause to toss a coin, burn incense, or whisper a prayer. The boundaries between sacred and ordinary space blurred. In Rome, the divine was never far away. Festivals marked the calendar, shaping the rhythm of the year as firmly as work or trade. In December, the city turned upside down for Saturnalia, a festival honoring Saturn, but also celebrating freedom and joy. For a week, social order was inverted. Slaves were allowed to feast, masters served their households, gifts were exchanged, and the streets rang with laughter. Green garlands adorned houses, candles flickered in windows, and Rome felt transformed by merriment. Even centuries later, Saturnalia's customs, gift-giving, feasting, lights in the darkest days of winter, would echo in other traditions. In February came Lupercalia, a far older and stranger ritual. Priests called Luperci ran through the streets, lightly striking bystanders with strips of goat hide. Women welcomed the touch, believing it brought fertility and eased childbirth. The ritual was boisterous, half sacred, half carnival, a blend of ancient superstition and civic celebration. June brought Vestalia, a quieter, more solemn festival dedicated to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Women carried offerings of simple food to her temple, barefoot and in silence, while her sacred flame burned under the care of the Vestal virgins. To honor Vesta was to honor the hearth itself, the center of every Roman home and of Rome as a whole. The flame symbolized continuity, linking each household fire to the eternal life of the city. But even outside of festivals, daily ritual was constant. Before meals, a libation of wine was poured to the gods. Farmers made offerings before planting and harvest. Soldiers prayed before battle. Merchants sprinkled incense before voyages. At every stage of life, birth, marriage, death, the gods were invoked, honored, and placated. Romans did not separate the sacred from the practical. Both were threads of the same cloth. Religion was also collective, a force binding the community. Public ceremonies brought citizens together in shared devotion, reminding them that Rome's success was not only due to armies and politics, but to divine favor. Triumphs, those grand parades celebrating military victories, always ended with sacrifices to Jupiter, as if to remind conquerors and crowds alike that Rome's power flowed from heaven as well as earth. For the ordinary Roman, however, the heart of faith was not in marble temples or grand rituals, but in the familiar gestures of daily life. Lighting a lamp before a small shrine, offering bread or figs to the lares, whispering thanks to the gods for a safe journey home. These simple acts were reminders of connection, protection, and gratitude. They were the invisible threads that tied families to their ancestors, households to the city, and Rome itself to the vast and varied divine. And so, in kitchens and courtyards, in crowded festivals and quiet prayers, Romans lived surrounded by gods. The sacred was not a separate world but an intimate presence, as close as the fire on the hearth and as vast as the sky above. When the sun set over Rome, the city did not disappear into silence, but it changed its character. The white marble of temples and baths turned grey in the fading light, and the bustle of daytime markets gave way to a different kind of life. As twilight deepened, oil lamps flickered to life in doorways and courtyards, their small flames casting halos of yellow against the darkness. Torches lit the fronts of taverns, and the glow of firelight spilled into the streets. But to step outside after dark was not without risk. Roman streets were narrow, uneven, and crowded with shadows. Without the natural protection of the daytime crowds, they became dangerous. Pickpockets prowled, drunken brawls broke out, and assaults were not uncommon. Wealthier citizens often avoided walking alone at night, sending slaves or guards ahead with lanterns or escorts. Satirists of the time joked that only fools or the desperate wandered the alleys after the sun went down. Night patrols, the vigiles, moved through the city carrying buckets and axes, more concerned with putting out fires than preventing crime. Though they provided some presence, their reach was limited, and the streets remained unpredictable once darkness settled. Inside homes, oil lamps replaced the sun. Clay lamps filled with olive oil were common, their simple wicks burning low and steady. Wealthier houses might use bronze or glass lamps, designed in decorative shapes, casting more elegant light across mosaics and painted walls. Shadows danced on plaster, and families gathered closer together, the day's work and worries easing into conversation. In crowded insulae, the glow of a single lamp might be shared by an entire family, its flame carefully tended so the night would not swallow the room entirely. For many, the evening meant taverns. Popine came alive with noise, cups striking counters, dice rattling in bowls, bursts of laughter and song. Cheap wine flowed, often sour and watered down, but enough to loosen tongues and stir arguments. Musicians played flutes or lyres, their notes weaving through the haze of smoke. Gambling was constant, bets laid on dice throws, chariot teams, or anything that might turn chance into gain or loss. These rooms were hot, crowded, and often rowdy, filled with sailors, laborers, and those seeking escape from long hours of toil. Prostitutes worked alongside servers, and quarrels sometimes ended in broken jugs or worse. The taverns were rarely refined, but they were alive, pulsing with energy until late into the night. The wealthy lived differently once darkness fell. Their homes turned inward, doors shut against the dangers outside. Evening meals could be elaborate affairs, dinners where family members reclined on couches around a low table, attended by servants carrying trays of roasted meats, vegetables, and fruit. Wine was poured and stories told, sometimes accompanied by hired performers. Poets reading verses, musicians playing softly, or storytellers spinning tales of myth and history. In quieter households, the evening was spent in conversation, with parents teaching children, reading scrolls, or enjoying games of strategy. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting a steady warmth over marble floors and painted ceilings, while beyond the walls the city roared and muttered in the night. Poets wrote of the city after dark with a mixture of fascination and dread. The same streets that by day carried senators and schoolchildren could by night echo with shouting, footsteps running, or silence so deep it felt uneasy. Torches guttered in the wind, leaving alleys in sudden darkness. In neighborhoods of insulae, the sound of arguments drifted through thin walls, mixed with crying infants, or the laughter of drinkers stumbling home. Yet there was beauty too, the cool air after the heat of the day, the moon glinting off rooftops, the hush that fell when the taverns finally grew quiet. Night was also the time when Rome prepared for the next day. Bakers began their work long before dawn, kneading dough in the dim light of ovens. Carts rumbled toward the markets, their wheels echoing across nearly empty streets. The city never truly slept. Its size and hunger demanded constant motion. Even as some lay down to rest, others were already stirring, carrying water, lighting fires, readying for the morning. And so the city's rhythm continued, flowing from light into darkness, from noise into quiet, from danger into rest. Night in Rome was a time of contrasts, both lively and perilous, intimate and chaotic, filled with laughter, music, whispers, and shadows. By the time the last lamps burned low and the streets grew still, Rome was already preparing to wake once more, to greet the rising sun with bread, voices, and the unbroken cycle of another day. The lamps of Rome flicker out, one by one, and the city yields to silence. What began with the clatter of carts and the cries of vendors ends with the faint glow of embers, the hush of families drifting to sleep, and the soft watch of the moon over stone and marble. We have walked through a day in this ancient city, heard the hammer of blacksmiths and the laughter of taverns, tasted bread dipped in wine and the sharp tang of garum, watched children at play and senators in debate, and felt the rhythm of rituals that brought gods into every home. Rome, so often remembered for its legions and conquests, was just as alive in the quiet rituals of daily life. And though 2,000 years divide us, something remains familiar. The warmth of shared meals, the joy of play, the need for rest, the flicker of lamplight before sleep. These are human threads, timeless and unbroken. So let the sounds of the city fade, leaving only calm and stillness. Breathe slowly, let your mind rest, and carry with you the gentle reminder that even in the busiest of worlds, night always comes and peace returns.